Will Smith adjusted his cap as he stepped into the lavish first-class cabin of Flight AA-297. A direct trip from Los Angeles to New York. It was supposed to be a peaceful flight. A break from the paparazzi, the relentless interviews, and the madness of Hollywood. For a man who had conquered box offices and walked the Oscar stage, a simple flight shouldn't have been a big deal. But life had other plans. He glanced around at the near-empty first-class section. Plush leather seats, warm lighting, and the subtle aroma of gourmet meals being prepared. A flight attendant, a woman in her mid-40s named Linda Pearson, stood near the aisle, inspecting the passenger list on her tablet. She had seen thousands of celebrities board flights, but when her eyes landed on Will Smith, they narrowed slightly. Something was off. She walked toward him, her polished black heels clicking against the carpet. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" she asked, forcing a professional smile. Will, ever the gentleman, reached into his pocket and handed it to her. Linda examined it, and then her expression changed, her brow furrowed, and her lips pressed into a tight line. "I'm sorry, Mr. Smith," she said, handing the ticket back. "There must be a mistake. This ticket is for business class, not first class." Will chuckled, thinking it was a joke. "That can't be right. My assistant booked first class." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails. "See? Confirmation right here." Linda barely glanced at the screen before shaking her head. "I understand, sir, but our system shows you're seated in business class. I'm going to have to ask you to move." A few heads turned. A businessman in the adjacent row adjusted his tie, pretending not to eavesdrop. A young couple exchanging whispers stared with wide eyes. Will's smile faded. He wasn't the kind of guy to cause a scene. "There's gotta be a misunderstanding. I paid for first class. Can we get someone to check?" Linda's voice hardened slightly. "I am the one to check, sir. And I'm afraid you'll need to move now." Something about the way she spoke, it wasn't just policy. It was personal. Will exhaled, trying to stay calm. "Look, I'm not trying to be difficult." But before he could finish, Linda stepped aside and gestured toward the business class section. "Sir, please." A tense silence hung in the air. The idea of Will Smith getting booted from first class? It was almost surreal. Yet here he was, holding a ticket that supposedly wasn't valid, being asked to take a seat elsewhere. A younger flight attendant, Emily, shifted nervously behind Linda, looking between Will and her superior. She seemed hesitant, as if she wanted to say something but didn't dare. Will glanced at her. "Is there someone I can talk to?" "A manager." "I am the cabin supervisor," Linda said coldly. "I suggest you comply, sir." Will Smith adjusted his cap as he stepped into the lavish first-class cabin of Flight AA-297. A direct trip from Los Angeles to New York. It was supposed to be a peaceful flight. A break from the paparazzi, the relentless interviews, and the madness of Hollywood. For a man who had conquered box offices and walked the Oscar stage, a simple flight shouldn't have been a big deal. But life had other plans. He glanced around at the near-empty first-class section. Plush leather seats, warm lighting, and the subtle aroma of gourmet meals being prepared. A flight attendant, a woman in her mid-40s named Linda Pearson, stood near the aisle, inspecting the passenger list on her tablet. She had seen thousands of celebrities board flights, but when her eyes landed on Will Smith, they narrowed slightly. Something was off. She walked toward him, her polished black heels clicking against the carpet. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" she asked, forcing a professional smile. Will, ever the gentleman, reached into his pocket and handed it to her. Linda examined it, and then her expression changed, her brow furrowed, and her lips pressed into a tight line. "I'm sorry, Mr. Smith," she said, handing the ticket back. "There must be a mistake. This ticket is for business class, not first class." Will chuckled, thinking it was a joke. "That can't be right. My assistant booked first class." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails. "See? Confirmation right here." Linda barely glanced at the screen before shaking her head. "I understand, sir, but our system shows you're seated in business class. I'm going to have to ask you to move." A few heads turned. A businessman in the adjacent row adjusted his tie, pretending not to eavesdrop. A young couple exchanging whispers stared with wide eyes. Will's smile faded. He wasn't the kind of guy to cause a scene. There's gotta be a misunderstanding. I paid for first class. Can we get someone to check? Linda's voice hardened slightly. I am the one to check, sir. And I'm afraid you'll need to move now. Something about the way she spoke, it wasn't just policy. It was personal. Will exhaled, trying to stay calm. Look, I'm not trying to be difficult. But before he could finish, Linda stepped aside and gestured toward the business class section. Sir, please. A tense silence hung in the air. The idea of Will Smith getting booted from first class? It was almost surreal. Yet here he was, holding a ticket that supposedly wasn't valid, being asked to take a seat elsewhere. A younger flight attendant, Emily, shifted nervously behind Linda, looking between Will and her superior. She seemed hesitant, as if she wanted to say something but didn't dare. Will glanced at her. Is there someone I can talk to? A manager. I am the cabin supervisor, Linda said coldly. I suggest you comply, sir. Will Smith turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Emily, the younger flight attendant. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her uniform. The entire first-class section had fallen silent, every passenger discreetly watching the unfolding drama. Linda, the senior flight attendant, shot Emily a glare sharp enough to cut glass. Emily, that's enough. But Emily hesitated, swallowing hard before speaking again. Sir, I think there's been a mistake. Linda stepped forward, her voice tight. Emily stepped back. Now. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. Will tilted his head slightly, his Hollywood instincts kicking in. He had played enough roles to recognize when someone was hiding something. His posture straightened, his usual charm momentarily replaced by curiosity and a hint of suspicion. A mistake? He repeated, eyeing Emily carefully. What kind of mistake? Emily glanced at Linda, then back at Will. Her lips parted as if to say something, but then she hesitated. Linda took a step closer, her voice now almost a whisper. Mr. Smith, you need to move to business class. Immediately. Will wasn't one to stir trouble, but something about Linda's insistence, her almost desperate tone, felt off. His gut told him there was more to this than a simple seating error. He shifted his gaze back to Emily. If there's something you need to say, now's the time. Emily bit her lip, her eyes flicking between Linda and Will. Then, in a barely audible voice, she muttered, You were on the first-class list, sir. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the cabin. Will's brows lifted slightly. Excuse me? Linda's face turned a deep shade of red. Emily, stop. But Emily continued, her voice growing steadier. I remember checking the manifest. You were assigned to first class, but... She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. But your name was removed, right before you boarded. Will's grip tightened on his carry-on. Removed? Emily nodded. Someone changed it. Just a few minutes ago. Will exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. He had dealt with Hollywood politics, the occasional mix-up, and even a fair share of public humiliation. But this was different. And he wasn't the only one who realized it. The businessman in the front row cleared his throat uncomfortably. The young couple exchanged glances, their eyes wide with intrigue. Linda straightened her blazer, forcing an icy smile. That's irrelevant, Mr. Smith. What matters is that you need to move to business class. Will inhaled deeply, taking a moment to gather himself. Then he did what he did best, he stayed cool. With an easygoing smile, he turned to Linda. Well, if it's irrelevant, then you won't mind telling me who changed it. Linda's fingers twitched at her side. That's none of your concern, she said quickly. Too quickly. And that's when Will knew something was being hidden from him. Emily, still visibly nervous, clutched her tablet. Sir, I might be able to check the system. Linda's head snapped toward her. Absolutely not. Will raised a brow. Why not? Linda's jaw clenched. Because it's airline policy. Will leaned against the seat, studying her. Airline policy? Or your policy? The tension had officially hit its peak. A few rows back, someone was quietly recording the conversation on their phone. This was no longer just a misunderstanding. Something was being covered up, and Will Smith wasn't going to let it slide. Will Smith's eyes narrowed as he stared at the tablet screen. Emily held it up with trembling hands, her face pale. The first-class seating chart was visible, and next to seat 2A, the very seat he had booked, was the name Richard Hayworth. But it wasn't just a simple name swap. There was a log of changes, a digital footprint showing exactly when the switch happened. 6:42 p.m. Passenger Will Smith assigned to seat 2A. 7:03 p.m. Passenger Richard Hayworth added to flight. 7:07 p.m. Seat 2A reassigned to Richard Hayworth. 7:08 p.m. Will Smith reassigned to business class, seat 6C. 7:09 p.m. Notes added. Do not allow reassignment. Will's breath caught. It wasn't a system error. It wasn't a simple mistake. Someone had deliberately removed him from first class, and they made sure he couldn't switch back. The businessman who had recognized Hayworth leaned forward, intrigued. This is weird. That senator's got a reputation for covering things up. Will exhaled sharply, rubbing his chin. He wasn't one for conspiracy theories, but this situation was getting more suspicious by the second. Emily bit her lip. Mr. Smith, there's more. She scrolled down, revealing a final, chilling detail. 7:12 p.m. High priority note added by admin. Ensure removal of subject before takeoff. No exceptions. Will felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Subject? Ensure removal? This wasn't about a booking mix-up. Someone had wanted him gone. His pulse quickened. Emily, who has access to change this? She hesitated. Only high-level administrators? Or someone with special authorization? Will's mind raced. Why would a senator, someone with political power, go out of his way to kick him out of a seat? And why the urgency? Linda, who had been standing silently, suddenly stepped forward, grabbing the tablet. That's enough, she hissed. But Will wasn't backing down now. Linda, he said, his voice steady but sharp. What aren't you telling me? Linda clenched her jaw. Mr. Smith, I suggest you take your seat in business class before you cause further disruption. A challenge. Will didn't move. The entire cabin was silent, watching. Even the passengers who had tried to stay out of it were now fully invested in what was happening. Will knew he had two choices. He could let it go, walk back to business class, pretend this never happened. Or he could push back and demand answers. And Will Smith wasn't the type to walk away from the truth. He stepped closer to Linda, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Linda, you're scared, he said softly. I can see it. You didn't make this call, did you? For a split second, she looked like she might break. But then, she straightened her posture, her face hardening again. I'm just following orders. Will studied her. Following orders. From who? And why? Just as he was about to press further, a deep voice interrupted. Excuse me. The air shifted. Will turned. Standing at the entrance of first class was a tall, gray-haired man in an expensive navy blue suit. His presence radiated authority, and his sharp eyes locked onto Will with an unreadable expression. Richard Hayworth, the senator, the man who had stolen his seat. Will felt his fists clench at his sides. And then, with a polite but icy smile, Hayworth spoke. There seems to be a misunderstanding, he said. Why don't we settle this like gentlemen? Will exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was about something much, much bigger. And he was about to find out what. A heavy silence filled the cabin as Senator Richard Hayworth took a slow, deliberate step toward Will. His piercing gray eyes held the kind of confidence that came with years of power, the kind that said, I always get what I want. Will, however, wasn't intimidated. He had dealt with A-list egos, Hollywood executives, and cutthroat industry politics. But something about Hayworth felt different. More calculated. More dangerous. The senator clasped his hands together, his expression unreadable. Mr. Smith, I believe this is all just an unfortunate mix-up. Will crossed his arms. A mix-up? He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. You expect me to believe that? Hayworth's lips curled into a polite, practiced smile. Believe whatever you like, but let's not make a scene over a simple seating arrangement. Will wasn't buying it. He knew a rehearsed line when he heard one. See, here's the thing, Will said, tilting his head slightly. If this was just a mix-up, then why did someone go out of their way to ensure my removal? Hayworth's jaw tightened. Bingo. Will had hit a nerve. Emily, still gripping her tablet, nervously glanced between the two men. The other passengers watched in stunned silence, fully aware that something much deeper was unfolding before them. The senator exhaled through his nose, then took a step closer, lowering his voice. Look, Will, can I call you Will? No, Will said flatly. A flicker of amusement crossed Hayworth's face before he continued. I'll be honest with you. Some people above me, weren't comfortable with you being in first class on this flight. Will raised a brow. People above you? Hayworth sighed, running a hand down his suit sleeve as if this conversation was beneath him. You don't need to concern yourself with the details. Will scoffed. Oh, see, that's where you're wrong. Because when someone intentionally boots me out of a seat I paid for, and then tries to cover it up, I'd say that's very much my concern. Linda shifted uncomfortably, while Emily remained frozen in place, her fingers gripping the tablet even tighter. The senator studied Will for a long moment. Then, with a sudden change in tone, he leaned in slightly. I'll make you an offer, he said quietly. Take your seat in business class. Enjoy the rest of the flight, and I'll personally make sure you're compensated generously. Will let out a short, humorless laugh. You trying to buy me off? Hayworth's smile never wavered. I'm trying to avoid unnecessary trouble. Will took a slow breath, his mind racing. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about an accidental reassignment. This was about something bigger, something intentional. And now Will was in the middle of it. He glanced at Emily, who was still holding up the tablet. He didn't need to see it again. He already knew what it said. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure he wasn't sitting in seat 2A. The question was, why? And more importantly, what was Senator Richard Hayworth so desperate to hide? Will took a deep breath and looked Hayworth straight in the eye. No deal, he said. The senator's smile faltered, just for a split second. And that's when Will knew he had made the right choice. But he also knew something else. He had just made himself a target. The smile on Senator Hayworth's face disappeared. The mask of polite indifference he had been wearing cracked, revealing something colder underneath. Will saw it immediately, the momentary flicker of annoyance in the senator's eyes. This wasn't a man used to being told no. A tense silence filled the first-class cabin. Every passenger, every flight attendant, even the businessman in the first row, everyone was watching. Hayworth inhaled deeply, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive navy blue suit. I see, he said, his voice still calm but lacking the false warmth it had earlier. You're not the type to take the easy way out. Will didn't respond. He didn't need to. The senator sighed, shaking his head slightly. Then, lowering his voice to a near whisper, he leaned in just enough so only Will could hear. Be careful, Mr. Smith, he said, his tone now eerily measured. You have no idea what you're stepping into. Will's eyes narrowed. Is that a threat, Senator? He asked. Hayworth gave a small, almost amused chuckle. It's a warning. Will stood his ground, refusing to back down. Well, I've never been good at following warnings. The senator exhaled sharply, then straightened his posture. Suit yourself. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward his seat in 2A. Will's seat. Linda, still visibly shaken, cleared her throat and forced a strained smile. Now, Mr. Smith, she said, please return to your assigned seat in business class so we can proceed with the flight. Will didn't move. His mind was spinning. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. Something was happening on this flight. And whatever it was, someone didn't want him around to see it. But why? His instincts told him that walking away now would be the safest move. But Will wasn't the type to just let things go. Especially not when something felt this wrong. And then, almost as if on cue, Emily's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Smith," she said cautiously. He turned to her. Her hands were still gripping the tablet tightly, her knuckles white, and there was fear in her eyes. She glanced around nervously before lowering her voice. "There's something else." Will frowned. "What?" Emily swallowed hard, hesitating for a split second. Then, making sure no one else could hear, she tilted the screen toward him. His eyes scanned the tablet, and his stomach dropped, because there, in small red text, was something he hadn't noticed before. Right under the 7:12 p.m. system note that had marked his removal from first class, there was one final line. 7:14 p.m. Confirm VIP security override for passenger transfer. Will's pulse quickened. Passenger transfer? Security override? What the hell was going on? Emily looked up at him. Fear etched across her face. "Mr. Smith, I don't think you were just removed from your seat." She took a breath before whispering the words that made Will's blood run cold. "I think someone was trying to remove you from this flight." Will's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the screen. A VIP security override? A passenger transfer? This wasn't just about a seat. Someone had tried to keep him off this plane entirely. His instincts screamed at him. Something isn't right. He glanced up at Emily, who looked like she regretted showing him the information. "What does that mean?" Will asked, keeping his voice low. Emily licked her lips nervously. I don't know exactly," she admitted. "But this level of override, it's rare. And usually, it's only done when there's a security concern about a passenger." Will's jaw clenched. A security concern? About him? That didn't make sense. He was just an actor, an entertainer. Not some political figure. Not some criminal. So why was someone pulling strings to get him off this flight? His mind raced, trying to piece it together. And then, he remembered something. Just 48 hours ago, he had been at a private event in Los Angeles. A high-profile charity gala. It was one of those exclusive, invitation-only affairs, filled with billionaires, politicians, and CEOs. Will had barely paid attention to the guest list. He had been there to support a good cause. But now he wondered, had he seen someone there? Had he overheard something? He couldn't shake the feeling that this went deeper than just a seat swap. A nervous cough brought him back to the present. Linda, the head flight attendant, had stepped forward again, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Mr. Smith," she said, her tone sharper than before, "please take your seat in business class. This is the final time I'll ask before we involve security." A not-so-subtle threat. Will glanced at Emily again. She looked down at her tablet, then at Linda, then back at him. And then, in the smallest movement possible, she shook her head. It was almost imperceptible. But Will caught it. She was warning him, telling him not to sit down. He swallowed hard. Something was going on. And if he sat in business class, if he let this slide, if he ignored his gut feeling, he might regret it. He exhaled slowly, lifting his eyes to Linda. "I need to make a call." Linda frowned. "Sir, you're not allowed to use your phone while we're preparing for takeoff." Will's expression didn't change. "Then I need to get off this plane." A ripple of murmurs swept through the first-class cabin. Emily's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to say that out loud. Linda's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Smith, I'm not asking," Will interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. Now, he wasn't just suspicious, he was certain. Something was wrong, and he wasn't about to stick around to find out what. Linda hesitated for a moment. Then she let out a long breath, clearly frustrated, and turned toward the front of the plane. "Fine," she muttered. "Let me inform the captain." Will didn't move. Neither did Emily. Neither did Senator Hayworth, who was watching the scene unfold with cold amusement. Will turned to him. Their eyes met, and for the first time since this whole mess started, the senator smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a knowing smile, the kind that said, "You have no idea what you've just walked into." The tension in the first-class cabin was suffocating. Will could feel every pair of eyes locked onto him as Linda marched toward the cockpit. The murmurs of the passengers grew louder, whispers of speculation weaving through the air like static electricity before a storm. Will knew one thing: he needed to get off this plane, and he needed to do it fast. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched the tablet, her eyes darting toward the cockpit door. She was scared. She had seen something she wasn't supposed to, and now, she was in as much danger as he was. He leaned in slightly, speaking just low enough for only her to hear. "You trust the system?" Emily hesitated. I used to." That was all Will needed to hear. Before he could say anything else, the cockpit door clicked open, and a uniformed officer stepped out, an air marshal. Will's heart sank. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded the kind of authority that meant he wasn't here to play games. His badge glinted under the overhead lights as he approached. "Mr. Smith," the marshal said, his voice even. "I understand you've requested to deplane." Will nodded, keeping his face neutral. "Yeah, that's right." The marshal didn't blink. "Mind telling me why?" Will's mind worked at lightning speed. He could feel the weight of Senator Hayworth's gaze still on him, and the last thing he wanted was to tip his hand too soon. "I don't feel comfortable with how this flight is being handled," Will said carefully. The marshal's face remained unreadable. "I understand, but requesting to deplane after the doors have been secured is a serious matter. Are you feeling unwell? Do you believe there's a security risk?" Will could tell that this was a trap. If he said yes to the security question, they'd isolate him for questioning and possibly detain him. If he said he was feeling unwell, they'd check his vitals and dismiss him as paranoid. Either way, he'd lose control of the situation. So instead, he did what he did best. He acted. He let out a sharp exhale, rubbing his temples like he was frustrated. "Look, man, I just don't want to fly today. Call it a bad feeling, call it intuition, whatever. But I'm a paying passenger, and I know my rights. If I don't want to be on this plane, I don't have to be." The marshal studied him, measuring his words. Will held his breath, waiting. Finally, the marshal sighed and pressed the radio on his shoulder. "Captain, this is Marshal Carter," he said. "Passenger 17B is requesting deplaning." "What's the call?" A crackling response came through. "We're already at final checks. If he insists, we'll have to delay takeoff and taxi back to the gate." Silence followed. Then Carter turned to Will. "Are you sure about this?" Will nodded. "Yeah." Carter exhaled and motioned toward the front of the plane. "All right, grab your things." Will didn't hesitate. He turned toward the overhead compartment, reached for his carry-on, and then everything went to hell. A sharp gasp echoed from behind him. Emily. Her face had gone completely pale, her hands shaking as she stared down at her tablet. Will's stomach dropped. "What?" he asked, his voice tight. She slowly turned the screen toward him, her hands trembling. There was a new message on the flight's internal log. A message that hadn't been there a minute ago. 7:19 p.m. Confirm passenger 17B has been removed. Proceed with cargo transfer. Cargo transfer. Will's blood turned to ice. Because he was passenger 17B. And if the system was already marking him as removed, what the hell was being transferred in his place? A cold chill ran down Will's spine. He wasn't the paranoid type. He had spent decades in Hollywood, seen all kinds of power plays, manipulation, and corporate greed. But this was something else. The flight system had already marked him as removed. But he was still here. That meant whatever was being transferred in his place, it was already in motion. And suddenly it all clicked. The seat swap, the VIP security override, the senator's smug, knowing smile. This wasn't about Will Smith. This was about keeping someone else on board. Or keeping something on board. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. He turned sharply to Emily. "Do you have access to the cargo manifest?" Emily blinked, startled. I shouldn't. But can you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I might be able to pull it up through the internal system. But if I do," her voice dropped into a whisper, If I do, they'll know I looked. Will held her gaze. Then look fast. Emily swallowed hard but didn't hesitate any further. Her fingers flew over the screen, navigating past layers of security with the precision of someone who had been doing this job for years. A few tense seconds passed. Then her breath hitched. Oh my God! Will leaned in. What? She turned the screen to him. There it was, the cargo manifest for this flight. And at the bottom, listed under special handling, was something that made Will's stomach twist into knots. Item description: secure diplomatic shipment. Origin: Washington, D.C. Destination: undisclosed. Handler: Senator Richard Hayworth. Will's jaw tightened. Diplomatic shipment. Washington, D.C. Senator Hayworth. This wasn't just a routine flight. Something big was happening. He stole a glance at the senator, who was now casually flipping through a magazine like he hadn't just orchestrated an entire covert operation at 30,000 feet. But Will wasn't stupid. The senator had wanted him gone for a reason. Because whatever was in that diplomatic shipment, whatever was in the cargo hold, wasn't supposed to have witnesses. Will inhaled deeply, trying to keep his face neutral. He turned back to Emily, keeping his voice low. Do you have any way of seeing what's in that shipment? Emily shook her head, still looking like she might pass out. No, but diplomatic cargo usually means high-level clearance. State secrets, classified tech, sometimes even... She trailed off. Will's brow furrowed. Even what? Emily swallowed. Live cargo. Will froze. Live cargo? His mind reeled. That could mean anything from biological material to... someone. His stomach churned. If something or someone was in that shipment, and if the senator had worked this hard to keep him off this flight, then maybe Will wasn't just a bystander. Maybe he was a loose end. And if that was the case, he wasn't getting off this plane alive. The realization hit him like a freight train. He could see it in Emily's face. She knew it too. And then, a sharp voice cut through the air. Everything all right, Mr. Smith? Will's head snapped up. The senator was watching him now. His expression was unreadable. But his eyes said everything. He knew Will had figured it out. And suddenly, the walls of the first-class cabin felt much smaller. Will forced a casual smile. Yeah, he said. Just deciding if I really want to get off this flight. The senator held his gaze for a long moment. Then, he smiled. The same smug, knowing smile from before. Oh, he said, voice smooth as silk. I think you'll find it's a lot safer if you stay. And just like that, Will knew he was trapped. Will's mind raced. The pieces had all fallen into place. This wasn't just about a seat mix-up or a flight delay. This was bigger. The senator wanted him off the plane. Why? Because something or someone was being transported in that diplomatic shipment. And if Will had figured it out, then he was a threat. A loose end. A problem that needed to be taken care of. He forced himself to stay calm, even as his pulse pounded in his ears. Emily still held the tablet, her fingers gripping the edges like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Will needed a plan, and he needed one now. The distraction. The Air Marshal Carter was still standing nearby, watching everything unfold. Will knew he was the only real wild card in this situation. If the senator had orchestrated all of this, then Carter might already be compromised. But there was only one way to find out. Will turned to Carter and did something unexpected. He raised his voice. Hey man, he said, loud enough for half the first-class cabin to hear. You got a protocol for when a flight is carrying something illegal? The reaction was instantaneous. Passengers turned in their seats. Flight attendants froze. Even Linda, who had been glaring at Will this whole time, blinked in confusion. The senator's smile vanished. And Carter? His eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Carter asked, his hand resting just slightly on his hip near his weapon. Will took a step forward, making sure every single person in the cabin was now listening. I just think it's kind of weird, Will continued, that the system already marked me as removed from this flight. More murmurs. Carter's expression darkened. That's not possible. Will turned to Emily, who hesitated before flipping the tablet around so Carter could see the screen. There it was. 7:19 p.m. Confirm passenger 17B has been removed. Proceed with cargo transfer. Carter's face went pale. For a split second, Will saw genuine confusion in the marshal's eyes. That was it. That was all he needed to know. Carter wasn't in on it. He was being played just like Will. And the senator knew it. The senator's mistake. Senator Hayworth stood up slowly, smoothing out his suit jacket. His expression was calm, but Will could see the tension in his jaw. "Mr. Smith," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the weight of power, "I would be careful throwing around accusations. You are, after all, a guest on this flight." Will laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was just so obvious now. "This ain't about me, is it?" he said, shaking his head. "It's about whatever's in that cargo hold." The senator's eyes flashed. That was it. That was the tell. He knew. And now Carter knew too. The marshal's hand tightened on his holster. "Senator, what's in that diplomatic shipment?" The entire cabin went dead silent. Linda, the flight attendant, looked panicked. The other passengers were staring. Some gripping their armrests like this had suddenly turned into a hostage situation. The senator, for the first time, looked uncertain. But only for a moment. Then he smiled again. And that's when Will saw it. The smallest movement. The senator's hand, reaching into his suit pocket. A gun? A trigger? A phone call to make someone disappear? Will wasn't waiting to find out. The takedown. Before the senator could move an inch further, Will reacted. With a swift motion, he grabbed the nearest glass of water from a flight attendant's tray and threw it straight into the senator's face. It wasn't a knockout punch, but it was enough. The senator jerked backward, completely startled, and Carter moved in. "Hands where I can see them," the marshal barked, yanking his weapon free and pointing it directly at the senator. Hayworth froze. Passengers gasped. "And Emily?" She whispered into her radio. "Captain, we need emergency personnel at the gate. Now." It was over. The aftermath. When the plane taxied back to the gate, authorities were waiting. The senator was escorted off in handcuffs, his diplomatic status unable to save him from the fact that the entire first-class cabin had witnessed everything. Will didn't stick around for the full debrief. But as he stepped off the jet bridge, he turned to Emily, who still looked stunned by everything that had happened. "You okay?" he asked. She exhaled shakily, then gave him a small smile. "You just took down a senator." Will grinned. "Yeah, guess I did." She hesitated, then said, "Thank you." Will chuckled. "Nah," he said. "Thank you." And with that, he walked into the airport, disappearing into the crowd. Because in the end, it wasn't about first class. It wasn't about a seat mix-up. It was about being in the wrong place at the right time. And sometimes, that's exactly what it takes to change everything.